off as contradictions. We are here to play in that realm of contradiction and cognitive dissonance. We are here to infect your mind.
Welcome back to the Cognitive Dissonance Podcast. New year, same show. Kristy and I put our heads together and decided that we would start the new year with a new multi-part series on social psychology. In this episode, we chart the landscape of social psychology, trying to give a rundown of the basic premises, topics, and subtopics covered in issues dealt within the realm of social psychology, such as parasocial interaction, social media use, radicalization, and we even touch on communication a little bit. All as a conversation to explore how individual human beings' psychology is influenced by the social interactions that we engage with and consume on a daily basis. Especially now more than ever in the attention economy, social psychology seems to be prevalent in ways that it was never able to be before. As always, if you enjoy what we do, please spread the word, like, share, bring a friend, plant a bug in somebody's ear. Kristy and I come out of pocket for both time and whatever fees we accrue using the platforms that we do. So any support or growing fan base for that is appreciated more than you guys can know. It gives us a reason to continue doing what we're doing. So again, if you enjoy what we have to offer, please spread the word, and I hope you all enjoy. Okay, where do you want to start?
Honestly, if we're talking about social psychology, it helps to put it in a little bit of context with when it was really popular and why it's kind of died down, or why we want to talk about this topic at all.
Well, I think there's been, I don't want to call it a renaissance or a revitalization, but there's been a renewal, we'll call it that, of social psychology, at least in one flavor of the field in, let's say, the past 10 years. I know Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff do a lot of work together, and they're social psychologists, and their work's been fairly influential. And I think if we're being openly honest, that in today's attention consumption environment, that social psychology is more prevalent than ever. At least in the sense that now more than at any time in human history, we have the pressures of our social groups weighing down on us to make our individual psychological decisions.
Yeah, I think the 90s, there was a little bit of a resurgence as well, because with the internet and getting new information that fast, and then the 24-hour news cycle, and then like showing people information, it changes things and the way people think and act and respond, and that was very interesting. And then at a certain point, like, you get it and you move on, but there's always something. I think social psychology is really unique in psychology because every decade you're going to have to study something completely different with people thinking completely different things. And it's so fluid that it's hard to really build anything, because the second you've got it done, we've moved on, which is true for a lot of psychology, but definitely social psychology.
Well, because, I mean, yes and no. So, like, three things, if I can remember and keep them in order. First, I want to return to how you differentiate sociology from social psychology, but we'll come back to that one. So second, I guess second and third, we'll just put them together. I'm struggling to put this into words, but I'm thinking of the idea that like a piece of music or a piece of art or a painting, right, is supposed to be seen from a certain distance. If you get too close, you can see nothing but individual details and you can't see how they work together, right? You get too far out and all you see is the gestalt. You see the totality of it without enough differentiating detail within the individual pieces to see how they merge together, right? I was explaining this to my students a couple of days ago. When you listen to music, you're not listening to each individual note from each individual instrument. That would be maddening. It wouldn't make any sense. It'd be chaos. And then likewise, if you zoom out too much, all you hear is just static white noise. You have to be at that perfect distance between where the individual notes blend together and it is the whole greater than the sum of its parts. It is the harmony within all of the individual component pieces that has it transcend the gestalt and where you get the actual totalizing view of it. So with that in mind, as far as social psychology, and every decade you have to redo everything to some degree, yes, because the social forces and social conventions that we are prey to change. But then also at the same time, that's part of what makes human beings so remarkable is that we have this psychological framework and disposition that allows us to be generalists. No matter how much the environment changes, we're able to interact, integrate, and succeed ultimately.
Mm-hmm. I think with social norms, and it kind of sounds like you're talking about group dynamics specifically, which is it's a huge chunk of social psychology and tends to not change that much decade to decade with, if you put someone in a lab coat in the front of the room and they start telling you to do things, you're probably going to trust that person as an authority figure. And that's been pretty consistent, I would say, for whatever reason. And then other things like norms and roles, those things are very fluid. And I think understanding why we do those things and then also understanding what those things are is kind of two parts as well, or two separate things. So why do we have social norms? Why do we do this? And it comes down to, heuristics and taking shortcuts and getting everything very quickly understood so that every time you walk into a gas station, you can just talk to the person behind the counter wearing a badge as an employee without having to ask or wander around, because you've done that before. You know what that looks like. You can assume. Who knows if that's actually an employee? Maybe they're just in costume. But that is some of the shortcuts that we do that are super helpful to save time. And that's something that I think, I want to say like the 60s, they started really solidifying those, why we have those, why we will always have those.
Yeah, and that's something I think about a lot is heuristics are absolutely fundamental to engagement with reality, right? Evolution is a heuristic generating device, process, whatever. For exactly that reason, we have literally a near infinite amount of sensory inputs that we have to cognitively process and separate the wheat from the chaff through every second of every minute of every day.
Mm-hmm.
Right. If I mean, that's why the focal spot for human vision is as narrow as it is, because if we were to have a full 180-degree view with the same resolution as our focal point, right? I don't even think there's a computer on Earth, even if we tie them all together, that could do that computation in the amount of time necessary to make any relevance of that information.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So, I mean, we have to lower the resolution enough to find that balance point between accuracy and efficiency.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and keeping errors as rare as we can get them within reason. There's going to be some errors, but where's the line between, this is an error that happens every day, but it's no big deal, and this is a very rare error with those heuristics and understanding, because it would be very bad if you did not realize there was a car careening down the street and you enter the crosswalk. That's a mistake that you don't want to make, but it's not a big deal if you start talking to someone thinking that they're your friend and realize a sentence in, oh, I don't actually know this person. So,
well, in that
similar errors, but different consequences.
And that overlays really nicely with as an analogy to how the human genome works. So I read recently, and I can't remember the source, but I need to find it again so I can read it more closely. That a phenomenon that tends to happen within the human genome is as our DNA has sporadic and random mutations, that older parts of the human genome tend to be prioritized over younger parts as far as error correction. So if there's a random mutation, which can happen anywhere along the modern human genome, that if it's parts that have evolved or changed or have been successful mutations in the past 1,000 or so years, those get played around with a lot more. Those are allowed to do their own thing because they're not as fundamental and necessary for survival of the human species on, with relationship to our environment. Whereas the foundation of the human genome, potentially reaching back 2 million years, 3 million years, that those areas of our genome tend to be at least addressed, if not repaired, almost instantaneously. Right, which overlaps really nicely with what you're saying, that the heuristics that tend to work most fundamentally need to have as much error correction built in as possible.
Mm-hmm.
Those that are newer, right, those more contemporary and or decade by decade social conventions, that's part of the reason why they're decade by decade, is because we play around with them. The error correction probability drops really low, and then we realize that that's just not effective or efficient anymore, and we just scrap it and generate a new one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a great. I'm thinking like having kidneys, pretty important, going to be high up the chain in your DNA to make whatever proteins that your kidneys make to make them look that way and do what they do, versus being lactose tolerant and lactose intolerant. It's a huge variability. Some people can drink milk, other people can't, but most people were born with both their kidneys. And
in one instance, the older, the more variation, the less probability of survival. Mm-hmm. In the newer variation, the probability of survival is near neutral. Mm-hmm. Comparing the two, lactose intolerant versus lactose tolerant, like you can survive just fine nowadays without consuming dairy. Yeah. You might have to take some supplements for calcium and things like that, but modern medicine, we have those. There are alternative forms. The only alternative kidneys that I know of are super expensive and keep you tied to a room.
Right. Well, that is if you had kidneys and that later lost them, mm-hmm. That tends to work. But if you just don't have them, yeah, I'm thinking of like fetal, in utero, like, yeah, oh, this baby doesn't have kidneys.
Fetal viability drops to near 0%.
Right. Yeah. So those are but it still happens. Yeah. So something I think is really good context for social psychology is kind of why we started studying it with such fervor in the 60s, which is kind of when all of the prolific studies that you hear of and the horror movies that they make out of them all came from that era. Because before the answer is World War II. After World War II, social psychology started to be a huge interest, like in pop culture. People wanted to know, why did that happen? Why did all of these people go absolutely nuts and then just snap back into being a normal country again? Well, not a snap, simplifying, but they're all humans again. And people started looking at conformity and propaganda and influence and authority and figuring out how it worked, why it worked, who it works on, how long it works, and answering all of those questions in a scientific way, which obviously these are things that people have been using forever. We know how to influence people or have authority over people before we started writing it down and doing studies on it. And then really in the 60s, they started looking at exactly how to do it, which is good. It's better to understand the phenomenon than to just ignore it and pretend like it isn't there, because people will do it anyways.
Or to understand it more completely. So I wonder if that's a two-way street where propaganda and groupthink manipulation is the same core psychological phenomenon as psychogenic epidemics. The difference is origin point, if that makes sense, right? So Nazi Germany, as an example, you have a hyper-charismatic leader with a certain set of populist ideals that he's enforcing. And that generates compliance underneath the umbrella that because things are working out right now, that must prove that we're right. Continue on, et cetera, et cetera. The banality of evil, as it's called, right? The bureaucrats behind the desk signing all of the death papers, so far removed from the acts that they're just completely complacent about it. Mm-hmm. Whereas, like, after plagues in the Middle Ages, you would get those psychogenic epidemics. We could consider witch hunts, psychogenic epidemic. We could consider Elvis fever. Same forces at play, but rather than top-down imposition, it's more of a bottom-up grassroots reception.
Mm-hmm. Another example of that is Satanic Panic, where everyone and in the 80s feels like we shouldn't be doing that.
Yeah, well, I mean, and if you look at it, I think it's the same, or there's maybe not the same, but trying to find a good thing to do the Venn diagram overlap. Mm-hmm. Right? There's a lot of overlap there because it is, for lack of better terms, mass delusion on a population scale. Mm-hmm. The question is it or does it originate from an oligarchical set of propagandistic ideas pushed down from the top and people conform because social psychology people don't want to be the odd person out, or mm-hmm. whether it's inherent receptibility of a population that generates the phenomenon. Right. It's still mass coercion underneath a set of ideals or ideas.
Yeah. That's what one of the early like cool experiments I used to learn about is the Ash line guessing experiment, which when I explain it, you've probably heard of it, where they put 5 people in a room. One of them was a test subject who thought that the other 4 people in the room were test subjects, but they were not. And those 4 people had been told on like every third line to guess incorrectly. And the 5th guy always guessed with them.
Mm-hmm.
They would say, number 2 matches, number 2 matches.
Yeah, and almost unanimously.
And he would say the last, because they did this all on men, he would say whatever they said and like kind of look bewildered and like, you know, something going on, but they were so confident, and he didn't want to guess incorrectly because he wanted to give the correct answer, which would be, you know, number 1 matches the line. But he would say what they said. And then afterwards, you know, they brief him and let him in on it and tell him what happened. But even though, like, we just have this ability to put aside reality in order to work with the social group that we're in. And our priorities as humans tend to be, what is the human next to me doing? And that is more important than what I see right in front of me. Because if there's, you know, being part of the out group is evolutionarily a massive, deadly consequence versus, you know, thinking that this line is the correct length, much less consequences. So, yeah, I think once it starts and people, it feels like there's a majority thinking this, you don't actually know how many people actually think this and how many have just taken on and said, yeah, I believe you, or this is what I think, or this is my worldview. Communism is great, because of that social pressure. And that's something that you can't really measure or predict either on how strong that's going to be. Because in other environments, you are rewarded for being contrarian and having a different opinion and being unique. Like, so there are times in like high school classrooms where the person who wears their brand new fancy shirt and looks different is rewarded for that, given compliments, given lots of attention. And then other times they wear a brand new fancy shirt and they're bullied and made fun of. And so it's hard to predict what's going to happen and why sometimes being that out group is rewarded and valued, and sometimes being part of the out group is absolutely not what that person is going to do. And yeah, I think that's a great experiment too, because it's super benign. Like, who cares? That guy was fine.
Yeah. And I want to come back to that, because the implications of that research, which I am familiar with, should be terrifying to anybody with a brain. But going back to the being the outlier or not, this is something interesting. It is, I mean, it's in the fashion world, but I guess we could scale it out to look at any forms of individualistic expression. By definition, those that set the parameters of cool are never cool, right? Because they tend to have the personality disposition to where they're always on the cutting edge. They're always on the perimeter. They're always on the periphery. And it's as their expressions catch hold in popular culture that become cool to the average person. Well, that person it originated from is now part of the group, which is something they've never wanted to be to begin with, which hence why they were always so expressive. So therefore, like by definition, they're always one step ahead, but never associated with, so to speak. Which makes it really tricky to try and walk that line of like you said, which ones are going to be successful and which ones aren't. Now go ahead.
I was going to say the other factor, like once the ball is rolling and we've decided this is the in group, this is the out group, it is hard, if not impossible, to get people to backpedal on that and go back to the start, like for that particular thing. Like once that decision is made, the term a lot of people use is like the sunk cost. You've already spent, your money on your new pair of pants or to match and get the new nice thing, or you've gone your whole life being different and being the out group, and now all of a sudden people are copying you, and backpedaling to changing your opinion and saying, oh, I actually do want to be part of the in-group almost never happens for the same thing. Like,
Well,
obviously you will have multiple times to decide this, but once you're there, it's not changing.
Well, and there's some metaphysical truth there that we can't ignore. That is the way things work, at least as far as with abstractions, art, music, fashion, ideas, philosophies, things like that. Things that can be separated from the mundane, dirty, gritty, biological reality of everything. And again, that goes back to our generalist disposition psychologically as a species to always be, keep it in a more biologically scientific language, but always be a creature in an environment seeking an equilibrium, seeking a homeostasis. That's the term I'm looking for, right? Why do we hydrate? Well, because our blood needs to be a certain viscosity with which to effectively and efficiently run oxygen and nutrients through our whole system. And if it's too thin, it doesn't carry enough. If it's too thick, it doesn't move fast enough. So we never hit that spot where if I just maintain this, I'm perfect. Our body's always in a constant state of fluctuation, right? Now that can get abstracted out and pathologized, right? So there's, you mentioned the totalizing worldviews of communism earlier, right? So you have some more modern thinkers like Paulo Freire from Brazil that takes that concept of constant regeneration, constant seeking of homeostasis, and applies it to like that idea of anytime the patterns of behavior that break down the status quo with which for us to generate these new ideas to be better in the world, once they become the status quo, they therefore need to be broken down as well, because by definition, the status quo as a heuristic is prescribing an idea for how to relate to the world to people, which by definition is oppression, because you're not letting them be whatever they want to be, however they want to be, wherever they want to be. Right. So as long as you continue that generation, continue that perpetual revolution, then all of these new ideas that are, in his terms, beneficial to everybody never become static and traditional and conservative and perpetual. Going back to the experiment you mentioned earlier, I find it fascinating that it was almost 100% people that knew the correct answer to an obvious question deliberately answered wrong to not stand out
under those conditions, because you can repeat it. And if you tell someone before the experiment, like, make sure you're honest, give your honest answer, and prime them in that way, the effect is gone. They will say the right answer. Yeah, but without that priming,
I would say that is intervention of those same forces that you're trying to measure. Mm-hmm. Right? You're using an interaction between two people, which by definition is society to some degree, a social interaction with which to influence the patterns of behaviors of another. Mm-hmm. What I'm more interested in is modern day application of that. So the first thing that pops to mind is echo chambers on social media.
Mm-hmm.
You surround yourself with people that you know have a similar mind and attitude as you. And you can generate some astronomically outrageous conclusions on both sides of the spectrum just because people adopt a set of, for lack of better term, biases. And I say that in a neutral sense. Adopt a set of biases with which to be, to be like water on the mountainside, right? To find the path of least resistance within the group. Now, to some degree, that's necessary because we are social creatures. We cannot live by ourselves. We cannot live in isolation. And just like you said earlier, what the human next to me is doing is sometimes more important than reality is our reality.
Mm-hmm.
Right? We live we experience the world in such a way, and the world is constituted in such a way that what actually exists from a psychological and metaphysical sense is not individuals and objects or individuals and other individuals. It's the relationship between, right? There's always ever just a dyad. If there's no other person than me, then I have nothing with which to base the accuracy of my heuristics off of.
Right. It makes me think, well, I think the other thing that is sort of understood, but I don't think, like, what you get attention for saying versus what just kind of gets ignored. And attention being people yelling at you, telling you're an idiot, to stop, you're a bigot, whatever. And then attention being like, yes, say that. Oh my gosh, I'm so happy someone said it. Both of those are attention. And sometimes it does not matter to the person which one they're getting as long as someone is responding to what they said, which is why the echo keeps going, because this person got 20 comments on their post saying this. I'm going to say this. And the next person does yes, and you end up in some crazy hole where you believe the moon is hollow, which is
it's because I think the primary motivational systems for both of those reinforcements are the same, or at least they overlap enough to where deficiency in one can be partially made up for by excess in another.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So, you see this all the time, or at least I do in my classrooms. Youth and adolescents that don't receive enough positive reinforcement, positive attention.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Anybody that's been around a child knows that a child will get the attention it needs to thrive, or at least enough to get it through the day. And if it's not receiving positive attention, it will demand negative attention.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's an attention deficit. When I liken it to, or I explain it as hunger. Right? If you have someone that's stranded out in the desert, you can give them a well with which to hydrate themselves, and they'll be good. But in the absence of that, they will claw each other to death for a bottle of water to get them through the day.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I liken positive and negative attention.
Right. For some people, well, there's kind of two parts to that. For some people, they can't get the positive, so they get the negative. And then for other people, they genuinely like the negative attention more. Like, it's exciting. It gets your blood pressure up. Someone's yelling at me. They're making eye contact. I feel excited. And then and so some people think, confrontation is fun and exciting, and it's something that they just live for. And this isn't something that if you ask someone, they would understand or admit it be like, yeah, I love getting yelled at. But if you keep doing it and keep doing it and keep doing it, you love getting yelled at. Which
is that because they're teetering down the line of psychopathy or dark triad personality traits? Or is it because they've been conditioned in such a way? Right.
Yeah, it comes down to what's easiest to get.
And I think for that question that I posed, it's a little column A, little column B, right? So there are at any given time anywhere from 5 to 10% of the population is considered psychopathic, right? They're narcissistic, they're hedonistic, they're manipulative, they're Machiavellian, and that's how they understand the world. If that number ever rises too high, then like shit starts to break down, and that's no good for anybody. But I had one of my students a couple years ago do an honors project essay, and their research question was, are serial killers born or made? Mm-hmm. And the answer, as far as we could find, was yes. That there are, right? Because it's interesting that the way the brain is shaped, like form is always driven by function. So you change the way the brain is shaped, and it's going to change its fundamental function. Otherwise, it would have evolved to be the shape that you changed it into, right? Mm-hmm. But also at the same time, like that's not predeterministic of anybody's future behaviors until combined with the right environmental parameters. So one of the studies that my students looked at was a adverse early childhood events study. And what it found was that with, I'm not going to say unerring accuracy, because I honestly can't remember the statistic on the top of my head right now, but it's somewhere near 70% overlap with adolescents exhibiting behavioral traits of lowered empathy, increased apathy, right? The baseline markers needed to be cruel and be psychologically okay with it tended to come from early environments that were aggressive, violent, abusive, neglectful, all of those things that we know have negative impact on developing a person's developing psychology.
Yeah, the term that I like is, it's not your fault, but it is your problem. Like, you're born with this level, like you have XYZ, your mom had XYZ, her mom had XYZ, and they all have beaten the shit out of each other, and you're getting beat too. That's not your fault. But when you have kids, that is now your problem to deal with. And I think framing it that way is empathetic enough to understand where it comes from, but not empathetic that you don't hold people accountable for their actions as adults. And
yeah, because I mean, we don't
feels
want
like a right space to be.
Yeah, well, because the general consensus among Western society, the past generation or so, or the primary ethos, the driving ethos, seems to be something like unending compassion. And when we come back from our break, I'll explain what I mean by that. Right. So what I mean by compassion as the primary driving ethos in Western democracies is best explained with an analogy. And that analogy is the typical parental dilemma, right? So as parents, we have children, and to some degree, it is our job to shelter our children from the world so that way they can grow up and be healthy and develop properly and not get beaten down by life too early. But when that becomes pathologized, it can become crippling. So we don't let our toddlers have knives to cut their food because we don't want them to cut themselves. But if you're always in perpetual fear of your child cutting themselves, you always cut their food for them. And now they don't learn how. Similarly, I could teach my kids to do laundry, but they might slam the lid closed on their hands. That could break one of their fingers. That's something to be avoided. That would be pain. That's bad. But if I always do their laundry for them, right, I'm not creating an environment with which they can learn healthily how to interact with the world and be successful. Rather, I'm creating an environment with which they develop a stream of pathologized dependency. And then I'm stuck with a 46-year-old man-child in my basement that's unable to exist outside of the protective wings of mother hen.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that a lot of that is what's happening. That's the bubble wrap everything mentality, right? Starting with my generation. In the 90s, we started seeing a really big trend with being overprotective. And I think we're dealing with the consequences of that now to some degree.
Yeah, I'm thinking of like the stranger danger and guy in a trench coat and that type of absolutely useless waste of resources and training kids to watch out for snatchers and like black eye masks, because it's inaccurate, not what happens. But
no, like a legitimate fear, but such a low percentage of everybody's collective lived experience that being overly protective, now you're creating a person that can't go to Walmart and shop for themselves because they're surrounded by strangers. And all of them are dangerous, right? It becomes a hindrance.
Right. So the fine line then is giving your child experiences that are risky and increasing that risk as they age and gain independence without getting them killed in the process.
It's Igor Vygotsky's zone of proximal development, right? A task needs to be challenging enough for there to be a risk of failure, but supportive enough for people to be willing to take a risk. And it's in that very fine line balance point between the two that the optimum condition for efficient and effective learning occurs. Right. That we use that when we try and develop our lesson plans for the activities that our students are going to do. If it's too easy, everybody gets bored and now they get crazy because they're high schoolers. That's what teenagers do. If it's too difficult, they don't even try. They just put the pencil down. They check out. It has to be a balance between the two. It has to be difficult enough to keep their attention and to be challenging and to be competitive. But it has to be supportive enough and easy enough for them to know that they can do it.
Right. Otherwise, yeah, it is a balance. And when it's got to be super individualized as well, which is one of the issues if you have 37 people in your classroom. How do you make something that everyone will succeed on enough?
Well,
get that like magic 85% or whatever.
Thankfully, we've got this cool thing called heuristics where we can lower the resolution of things enough to be more bite-sized digestible bits of information packed with enough latent and inherent transferable information for them to do something with. Right. In essence, that's what language is. I write the word bird, B-I-R-D, and that has with it a package of information. I mean, that's where the phrase "a picture's worth 1,000 words" comes from, because there's so much information. What is a bird? How birds look? How they interact? How we relate with them? All of that is hidden in with that word, and then it's the exchange of words and the coding on my end, articulation, reception on your end, and then decoding. That's how communication happens.
I think something that's interesting with that is it definitely goes both ways, where we put heuristics on others to better understand them, and that person is aware of what heuristic we're using, and they will change their behavior to fit what we think, usually subconsciously, but sometimes like purposefully, like, oh, this person thinks I'm smart, I'm going to study hard and be smart. This person thinks I'm an idiot, I'm not going to try, I'm going to fail everything. And it's the like main study for that was the Philip Zimbardo experiment, which was like a hammer on that concept. Like, we did not need that severe of example, but we got it. And that was the Stanford prison experiments, where they were put into the role of prisoner and put into the role of jailer, and they began to act in the role that they were given, which is helpful for learning new things. You know, when, like, just going back to high school, I'm in math class, I'm learning math. I just knowing those two things tells you all of the rest of the stuff that you're supposed to do, like be quiet, get your book out, have a pencil, be nervous because it's math, like those type of social expectations people will rise up to meet because they're aware of them. And obviously you can deliberately not do that if you want. But for the most part, it's easier to just do what people are expecting, which, you know, at the end of the day, those are like the roles, which goes into like social norms, gender roles, family roles, your job. And the point was that it goes both ways. We put a heuristic on someone and they fill that as well. So you can kind of have that like self-fulfilling prophecy where I think my child is extremely smart and capable, I'm going to push them. And the child also thinks they're smart and capable and is going to push themselves, which is, in those cases, pretty good, but it also works in negative ways as well.
Yeah, I would think that so you're absolutely right. We tend to see that, going back to my language and communication example, that most people, I guess intuitively or instinctively, start decoding what they think I am coding as I'm articulating and transmitting.
Right.
Right. And when those are aligned, when my heuristic for how I think you are expecting me to behave in this podcast lines up with how you're actually expecting me to behave in this podcast, then we do get those positive feedback loops. And not in a runaway sense, but that's when, I guess the old phrase, like, it was just easy. Right? Things become efficient, they become fluid, we hit that flow state, and things tend to work out. When they're very disaligned, that's when psychological disorders arise. I mean, to some degree, that's what anxiety is. Enough insecurity in how you think heuristics are being applied to you that it becomes crippling, you overanalyze, and you're unable to act effectively within those situations.
Right. Like social anxiety specifically.
Mm-hmm. Now, what's interesting, tying this back to social media, or even just media figures in general, because the human brain is extraordinarily capable at abstraction, we can do that heuristic feedback loop on our own. right? We can pathologize a certain idea of how someone else, real or fabricated, or is laying expectations upon us. And then we can act upon those expectations and then either use that to verify or invalidate those expectations, all without interaction from another person.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I guess to some degree, the technical term for that would be parasocial interaction or parasocial relationships, where
Indeed,
we let our idea of some person other than us play out an abstracted heuristic feedback loop.
yeah. I'm struggling for an example, though.
Right. So for instance, I mean, hell, not to be too controversial, but let's just dive right on in. Think about the whole "What would Jesus do" movement.
Mm-hmm.
Right. We have this, whether Jesus was a real person or not is irrelevant. Whether his teachings in the Bible have any metaphysical, metaphorical, or legitimate truth is completely irrelevant. What is relevant is we as a modern society have created this identity, this abstracted identity that we are using to modify our own behavior. We find ourselves in a situation and we look to this, and don't slay me for being too reductionistic with religious matters, but Jesus as the media personality. How would he handle this situation? And then we create that scenario and we apply those expectations to us.
Mm-hmm.
And we use that as a way to try and either live up to or to validate that we're never going to be good enough, right? So that goes back to the whole positive, negative thing. We can use it positively and we can create stability within our own lives. We can have psychological health. We can meaning, fulfillment, whatever. Or we can pathologize that the other way, right? And so, oh, well, I'm going to fail every single time by definition. If this character that I'm looking up to is the epitome of all goodness, then duh, I'm a flawed human. Of course I'm going to fall short. So why even try? I'm just going to own my sins because you know what? It is what it is.
I have ended up with this whole sort of personal complex with the word parasocial because the people who coined that term, which I think was in the 60s as well, like when social psychology was kind of extremely popular and people were tuning in to see what was next down the research pipe. The people who coined that term were artists, notably not psychologists. So it's become a popular term now because people use it to discredit the relationship of a figure and their audience when there comes to a point where with videos specifically or podcasts where you're hearing the person's voice and seeing them move, but at minimum hearing their voice, that the audience, the person listening, people will say, that's parasocial. You don't know that person. You feel emotions and a connection with this voice that you've been listening to, and none of that's real. And my issue with that is it is real because our brains have not and will never be able to put words spoken in a video to us and words spoken in real life to us in different boxes because it's processed the exact same way. You put someone in an fMRI and looked at their brain when someone is standing in the room talking with them or they're hearing it through headphones. All the same places light up, all the same processes take place. And I think that it's used to sort of undermine people who go crazy for like the artist that they like, or the YouTuber that they like, or the podcaster that they like, which is true. That's what happens. But saying that, your feelings aren't real doesn't solve the problem. And it's adding to the problem, because the person who like is that crazy stalker fan says, yes, my feelings are real. And I think the better thing to do is to educate people that happens. Your brain is storing that information as if your neighbor just walked into your living room and started talking to you, which is why consuming media, podcasts, videos of people who are extremist or wrong, or like you might as, if you wouldn't invite that person into your living room to talk to you face to face, you shouldn't listen to them, because your brain doesn't know that you're just tuning in for fun. Your brain, the same thing with trying to guess the lines, and the people next to you are saying a wrong answer, and you say the wrong answer as well to fit in. Your brain doesn't know that voice isn't a person sitting next to you in the room when it stores that and processes that information, which I think is why we see a lot of very extremist groups based on the internet that end up in real life and, for example, storm the Capitol. And we're not being careful enough as people, or educated enough as people and Americans, that the media that you consume is influencing you for real. Nothing para about it. That is social interaction. And I think telling people that it's parasocial is harming them more than hurting them. And it's not giving them the tools that they need to decide, what am I going to listen to and what am I not going to listen to protect yourself from being radicalized, which can happen to anyone and does happen to anyone.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. I think definition-wise, if we take parasocial by what the word phonetically means, as simply above or beyond social, it applies. Because that's not saying that one party isn't having an effect on the other, because it is. That's one of the defining characteristics of a parasocial relationship, is the inability of the person idealized to effectively and actually interact with the person who feels the deep connection. And that's part of what I found terrifying about the line experiment, is that we are wired for tribalism, right? We are wired to some degree place the needs of the group over truth, in a sense. And part of that is for evolutionary survival tactics. Those that tended to survive and procreate at a higher degree than those that didn't. Those that didn't tended to invite confrontation. And especially the farther back in time you go, confrontation exponentially means more and more death. Right? 200,000 years ago, as hunter-gatherers, if you broke your arm, there's an 80% chance you're not going to make it, type thing. Mm-hmm. You can't hunt, you can't help, you can't feed, you can't fend off anything. Like, you're going to get infected. It's not going to set right now. You're crippled for the rest of your life, however short and miserable that may be. Modern medicine does a lot to assuage the cruel reality of biological life for us. I will say that, and this is part of why I tend to be a free speech absolutist just about, is that without the ability to juxtapose good and bad ideas against each other, we have no way to validate why the good ideas are good and why the bad ideas are bad. Right? Mm-hmm. So the same way that in face-to-face social interactions, it takes seeing the delinquents, it takes seeing the miscreants and the outliers and the troublemakers to remind us that our preferred social groups are our preferred social groups for a reason, and that they're healthy for a reason, more or less, and that engagement in this set of behaviors has a higher chance of success rate than this set of behaviors. Now, when we're talking social media and the formations of parasocial relationships and parasocial interaction in that capacity, the echo chamber thing makes it really difficult to keep that free market, that open exchange of ideas open. And it tends to reinforce one side or the other. Right. And so just like you're saying, it is really easy for us to get into a landslide. And by us, I mean the human species, to get into a landslide of totalizing and dominating thoughts in the social media domain. But just like with anything, like you don't appreciate sunny days without rainy days. And you don't appreciate rainy days without sunny days. In the same way, we can't expect people to fully understand the travesties that an ideology like fascism or Nazism causes without exposure to how radical those ideas are to begin with. I mean, that's why people still read Aristotle. He's wrong about a lot of stuff, especially when he starts getting towards the sciences. But it is directly comparing him to future thinkers that allows us to get access to, for lack of better terms, and as a heuristic, truth. Same way, we look at, any of the major thinkers from any of the times pre-scientific revolution, and they're all wrong, more or less. There's like a 1% sliver that were like unreasonably accurate with everything that they did. Right? Look at Pythagoras. A couple other those people. There was the ancient Greek that used the length of shadows between Alexandria and another place in Egypt with which to measure the circumference of the earth, and he was correct down to like 100 kilometers or some nonsense like that. Like, that is mind-blowingly accurate. But almost everything else about what to do with that information has been wrong, but we don't discard it. Right? People still read Karl Marx. Communism has some 100 million dead to its name just in the contemporary era, if we include all of the enforced famines and things like that. But we don't ban it because we have to understand it to prevent it from happening, or at least to prevent the travesty it from happening. So that's really tricky. How do you imbibe enough toxin to develop an immunity without killing yourself?
I think for me, I have a complex about this because I don't think people know that if a 6-year-old is glued to an iPad watching a video of a guy like making slime, that might as well be in your house. That person, that woman, that man, whoever is in the video, if you wouldn't actually let them play with your child, they should not watch the video. It is the same thing. And I think like more education and awareness that this is not like, it should be taken extremely seriously. And that's not to say we need some government overreach to decide for us what we view and what we don't view. You just have to know that it will have the exact same effect as if it's happening in real life. And then you might go through all of that and say, yeah, I would have a conversation face to face with this person. I'd meet this person for coffee. I'd let this person watch my kid while I do the dishes. And then, that's fine. At that point, you've gone through all of the proper checks and balances that you would do if it was in real life, that you should be doing on video too. And so, especially with children, and then with adults as well. At a certain point as an adult, you've built enough skills in order to say, compare this view with what you believe and decide whether or not it fits or what you want to think and build your own opinion. And
or at the very least, you're old enough to be held accountable.
Yeah. And then other people, I think, don't realize, like, I'm thinking specifically of like Q people who are like absolutely nuts. And like that started as like opening an email or like seeing a post on Facebook or watching a conspiracy video, which are cool. That's an interesting thing. And then at the very end of the conspiracy video is like something cute, something that's not true. And you get to the end and you accept all of this information and that just gets lumped in. And then over time, you might as well have been going and attending these cult meetings in person because the effects are the exact same. And
it's even more pernicious and pervasive because the algorithms that most social media companies use tend to reinforce those decisions. So, there tends to be a pattern in YouTube videos, for instance, that when you watch a, entry-level conspiracy theory video, think Ancient Aliens on the History Channel or something like that.
Some fun stuff.
Yeah, which, interesting questions, right? In most of which rationally are probably, just a crock of shit. But in the absence of alternative evidence, they're fun to have, to play around with those ideas. There's enough to beg the question in some instances. But you watch those videos and YouTube tends to increase the depth of radicalization in the videos that it suggests to you because it knows with its algorithm that that's going to keep your attention, and we are in an attention economy. Likewise, now this has probably been changed because it's been circling the podcast for the past couple years. If you create a YouTube account and like you're registered as like a teenage girl or something like that, and you look up videos for the latest super healthy diet or whatever, what tends to happen is YouTube will promote anorexia videos to you. Right? It's taking that core concept. Hey, how can I be a healthier me? And it's reinforcing that pathologized view.
Right. And I think something that, because I do watch conspiracy videos. I love conspiracy videos. I think they're so fun. And for me, the more that you do that, like, it happens all the time, like where you see people kind of flip over the years. I'm thinking of people who Scientology is a good example where like you read about it, you make fun of it. That's ridiculous. Spaghetti monster in the sky, blah, blah, blah. And then 5 years later,
you're making donations.
They're in it. Yeah. Which you have to be aware that when you interact with those worldviews, that it can influence you into believing them too. And being aware that that's going to happen and noticing that is really, I think, the only thing that we can do, because you can't say we're going to ban all Scientology videos from YouTube, starting with the ones that make poke light fun and then, working your way down to the ones that are like absolutely serious. Like, let's put out a hit on people who leave the church. Like are they called a church? I don't know. I don't think
I think they call themselves a church.
Okay. So they Right. Like the answer is not ban it and restricting this information because we know that that doesn't work. Also, it's impossible. And it's a slippery slope. And the way to get around that and to protect people is to educate them on what can and will happen. And like the phrase is like, you are not immune to propaganda. And being aware of that and being able to identify propaganda and identify when someone is trying to influence you, and then use those skills that you've learned to decide, do I actually want to believe this and go down this path? Or am I just having fun and just watching videos and I need to go watch some cat videos now to like reset how I'm feeling? And that's why I hate the term parasocial, because it puts up a barrier and makes you feel like you're safe doing that when it's your brain has no clue. It is being processed the same way. So yeah, my goal would not be to restrict those things, but to let people know if you wouldn't go and attend the talk in person, you might not want to watch this video. And I think written language is processed a little bit differently. Like you can similarly, but differently. So you're a little bit safer reading about it because your brain knows that's not a person talking to you. So it is processed differently and a little bit better.
And I would have to imagine that because we know that because language is a heuristic, it's standardized, at least contemporarily. And what it's used for is to efficiently categorize things. So it tends to be left hemisphere processed dominant. Right, because that's what the left hemisphere of the brain tries to do. It tries to categorize quickly and effectively to reach destination. When a bird's flying through the sky, looking at the ground for seed, that's its left hemisphere, ignoring all of the other gestalt, all of the other factors of the world to hyper-focus to be able to pick the seed out of the grass on the ground. Nothing else. And so we categorize and we do things. That's what language does. Navigating in groups, navigating in person, navigating in complex three-dimensional space tends to be right hemisphere process dominant. Because what are you doing? You're not navigating from point A to point B like you would drawing a line on a piece of paper. Right? That's left hemisphere. That's very intent driven, goal driven. Categorize, process, get the task done, move on. Instead, what we're doing, we're navigating these fields of potential. If I act this way, how will that person act? How will that influence my next behavior? We're subconsciously playing these hyper-realistic chess games with our environment as we physically navigate through them. Right. So I think you would be absolutely right in that language is processed differently now, meaning less susceptible to the in-person influences of radicalization. Right?
Yeah, it's a little more protective.
Yeah, because like what does the right hemisphere of the brain do? The right hemisphere of the brain zooms out. So it can take in the totality of something. It can take in the gestalt. It looks at the relationships between all of the individual parts to understand the whole that is greater than the sum of the parts. And if that doesn't describe a social interaction, I don't know what else would describe it better. Right? Because that's exactly what we're doing. Right? When I'm in a classroom, I'm not worried about what this particular student thinks or needs. I am, but that's only like 1/20th. Right. I'm also trying to balance how is this student going to interact with this student? How is the combination of those two interacting going to affect my table group over here? How can I address all of their needs? That's right hemisphere work. That's not left hemisphere. When I'm sitting down and I'm grading their papers like I was earlier today, that is left hemisphere work. Addressing the individual particulars for their accuracy and then grading them accordingly. Right. So I do think that there would be some merit to saying that reading radicalizing material, especially in like a seminar setting, a Socratic circle, if you will, the neighborhood freaking book club once a week, right? With which to dismantle the ideas and understand the truth of the ideas and whether the ideas have inherent truth with them, right? Is way safer than engaging in practices that light up like fireworks all of our social reward systems.
Baxter just busted in the room. So, yes, there is still, our brains are very good. Like, if you sit down and imagine a conversation in your head, you can see that on an fMRI that someone is having a conversation, even though they're not talking and they're not hearing anybody. The same parts of your brains are used for that. So all of that to say, your reading, you can still get that effect. Your brain can still have those words as someone is speaking them to me. It's conversational. And you have to jump through a couple of hoops to do that. And it's a little more effortful, which is why it's still going to influence you, but not like a video will. And I think even with like today, book bans in schools and school districts are so stupid. And those same people who are banning Harry Potter in school are going home and letting their children watch whatever they want on YouTube, as if the book is going to influence them more than the video. And it's just a misplace of priority and like a misplace of trying to protect children from XYZ, which is whatever, but not knowing what to actually do, which is the point of social psychology and studying it and figuring out, this is the goal. How do we actually do that? Because this isn't working. We've been doing it wrong. These people figured it out and didn't tell anyone. Like, how do we spread the correct information so that people can be influenced and influence others in the way that they actually want to and intend to, without accidentally and sometimes purposefully creating a world war?
Well, and to the greatest degree of benefit for all parties involved.
Usually.
Right. Okay. I think that's a good place to stop unless you got anything else. We got like 30 seconds.
Yeah, I don't think we came full circle, kind of hoping conversation went how I expected, which might be the first time this has happened on our podcast.
Yeah. Practice makes perfect.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, next time, social psychology part 2.
All right. See you then.